Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So the last time we were together, we discussed or we read the author's preface of the concept of education in Islam by Professor Syed Naquib Al-Attas. And in the order of lectures, it became a sort of reversal or preempting of what was supposed to be before it, and that is the modern Western educational theories. Yes, modern Western educational theories and its impact on Muslim education. So therefore, I thought it would be good that we reverse a bit, therefore, to discuss the development of secular theories of education in order to understand Professor Syed Naquib Al-Attas' responses to it, yes, with the writing of that text, concept of education. Of course, when we see the monograph written by Professor Al-Attas, it is already very clear to us that the monograph had a long history, so to speak, because Professor Al-Attas proposed it initially as part of a paper in the Conference of Muslim Education, and in the latter half of the 20th century. And by then, the impact of Western education would have been known throughout the Muslim world. Yes, and we see that in the 1978 work, which Professor Attas wrote, Islam and Secularism, he did refer to how some of his contemporaries, in fact, the earlier Muslim contemporaries who tried to incorporate some of the Western ideals of teaching, that they were much more influenced by Western thinkers. And he cited a few of them, one of which was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Herbert Spencer, John Stuart Mill, he said. These three in particular were more influential to them compared to their own historical and classical and great scholars of the Salaf in the Islamic intellectual tradition. So they were much more influenced by these modern thinkers compared to, say, Imam Al-Ghazali, or compared to Imam Al-Zarnuji and the other great educational thinkers and theorists in the Islamic intellectual tradition. So therefore, I mean, we will try to look at, in our present session today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Theory of Education, because he stands to influence Herbert Spencer particularly, but also several other thinkers throughout the modern educational theories. And he was also taking influence from so he was like a central figure, as he was influenced by John Milton and several other Renaissance figures who basically were renewing their understanding of education. So as a bit of a background, as we know that in general, historians have described the 14th and the 15th, and some of them include the 16th century, as the centuries of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is precisely called the Renaissance, beginning as it was in Italy, as its focal point, as a translation of the term rebirth. And by rebirth, it is meant the rediscovery of the importance of the classical tradition, the rediscovery of the tradition that began with Athens, in Greece, and throughout, and also the Roman Empire, bearing in mind the likes of Cicero, and particularly the literary tradition. So when educational theories were initially designed in this to fit with the Renaissance, their first ideas was to replace the scholastic education, yes, the scholastic education of the church with the newly discovered classical education. And how is it different? Well, the scholastic education, as we know, as developed by the universities, yes, was influenced very much by the scholastic movement, which in turn was influenced by the translation movement from Greek to Arabic and Arabic to Latin. And the scholastic movement tended to focus on several texts, and in particular, it led to philosophy becoming the handmaiden to theology. When the Renaissance figures propounded their theories of education, they insisted rather on a new foundation of reality. So as opposed to theology, they established humanism as the basis of education, meaning to say that the purpose and the content of education is to promote a humanistic philosophy, meaning to say a man-focused philosophy, whereas previously it was a God-centered philosophy. The medieval worldview with the university tradition, with medieval architecture, tended to focus on the central worship of the divine, let us say, and theology becoming the queen of the sciences. With the humanities, with the Renaissance, humanities became the focus, and the focus was on the study of the classical tradition.
We are going to take a short break due to Azan, and we are going to continue afterwards, inshallah.
Yes. So as we were saying then, that during the Renaissance period, humanism became the focus, and initially it was a literary movement, meaning to say that tended to focus on how to produce men who are great in speeches. Yes, and the focus of the literary production was to study the great speeches and the great lives of the people in the West. And the product of Renaissance education is the likes of Shakespeare, is the likes of Machiavelli, and several of these thinkers, including, of course, the great political theorists, Thomas Hobbes. We will find that in their writings, their focus tended to be on the historical aspect of the classical period, and they tried to find in the classical heroes, so to speak, models for their present forms of leadership and statecraft, and the way to administer their lives. Gradually, however, we see then a movement from literary humanism to the study of the humanities for the sake of politics, as we said, and then eventually with the Baconian enterprise, i.e. Francis Bacon through his, let us say, manifesto in the New Atlantis and in several other works, the focus became more and more pragmatic. Bear in mind that by the 16th century or slightly earlier, the Europeans have now started their explorations in colonization and imperialism, and they started to conquer what was previously unknown territories to themselves, and they discovered several colonies throughout the world, which of course fostered their imagination. Perhaps scholarship on or early scholarship on these various types of people, yes, as part of the Pacific Islands, the North Americans, and the Canadians, meaning to say the Aborigines and Aboriginal people in these parts of the world, were more a description of their own imagination as opposed to the description of these societies. But nevertheless, it fostered the idea. It greatly expanded, let us say, their horizons, and leading them to move further and further away from the judgment set in stone, which was Christianity. And as we know that what had happened with regards to anthropology and social observation also happened in the realm of physics and mathematics and the study of nature with the Copernican revolution and the gradual discovery of the long lost, let us say, fossils, and their greater powers of observation and skills in classifying various types of organisms, leading eventually to what is known as the theory of evolution and the origins of species and so on. Now with this, certainly the educational theory would expand alongside, because education, as we know, is the means of how one society passes its values, its core values and virtues to the next generation. So if the worldview of a particular society is now being driven by the scientific cognitive enterprise, then the educational theory would clearly also reflect such changes. Until we get to the, as we said just now, to the naturalistic theories of the 16th and 17th centuries. By these times, we see that their movement away from religion to metaphysics became apparent in philosophy. We see, for example, with the likes of Descartes, Spinoza, and several of the continental philosophers, a rational system in which they still believe in the existence of a theistic being like a god that created the universe, and they still affirm let us say, the validity of natural theology, the idea that the world is created by a supreme, omniscient being, an all-knowing being. But nevertheless, this omniscience is now this omniscient, omnipresent being is no longer now the God of Christianity, but rather the mechanistic principle, let us say, that is discovered by a natural theology. So naturally, the framework of science now tended to influence the study of human beings, the study of man, and the study of psychology, and by extension, educational theory. So now we see that these are the elements when we wish to discuss the philosophy of education. First, metaphysics, meaning to say, what do you consider to be ultimately true and real? Second, the element of knowledge. Yes, what can man know? Yes, what can man know? What are the limits and what are the methods of learning? Thirdly, it is man himself. Who is he? Yes, and what is he capable of learning? So with reality, knowledge, and man, yes, these are the three primary elements that any philosopher of education must contend with properly before he can outline an educational theory. And likewise, therefore, the monumental, the colossal task of trying to Islamize present-day education, present-day philosophy of education, educational practice, and ethos, it cannot be done. Yes, it cannot be done without dealing with these fundamental issues. It is not something that is done merely by integrating some contents of Islamic education into the existing curriculum contents, curriculum contents from the primary curriculum to extra curriculum and various other types of curricular activities designed for a particular philosophy of education, and expect to Islamize it like that. So we see that in the history of educational theory, the secularization of society, secularization of knowledge, secularization of what we call the social ontology, meaning to say what is shared collectively with regards to what is understood to be real and true, has a bearing upon educational philosophy and theory. And we get then to our thinker that we wish to discuss today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Yes, as we know about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French thinker who lived towards the end of his life because of his, let us say, radical ideas. He had to move to Prussia at some point, and another point at Switzerland. And he also wrote an essay on Poland. I mean, to say that he was interested in the governance of the city-state of Poland, although he was a French-born citizen. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is special in this line of thought because he lived during the time of great social unrest. Yes, after as we said just now, after the period of the Renaissance and then the early modern period, society was moving more and more to European society was moving towards the Enlightenment period. And the basic premise of the Enlightenment is the idea that man have somehow marched progressively to the extent that as a collective society and as individuals forming such collectives, man is no longer in need, yes, of the guidance of external authority. And this external authority can be the shackles of tradition, the shackles of religion, and even the shackles of cultural philosophic tradition. So there is the shackles of society, cultural philosophic tradition, and religious tradition. So they rejected, of course, the authority of Aristotle in all affairs, and certainly the religious and the socio-cultural traditions that has shackled the individual liberties. So modernity, fostered as it is with the Enlightenment period, with the Enlightenment motto, sapere aude, which is dare to be wise, meaning to say that to be educated, to be intelligent, to be knowing of one's own interest is a matter of courage, let us say, just a matter of courage and a matter of diligence. Any person can learn whatever that is needed to be learned. The sole authority is one's own intellect and one's own powers of observation, meaning to say there is no authority outside of one's own intellect, let us say. So any person claiming to be an expert in anything, his expertise becomes a source of his authority only insofar as if another person with equal degree of, let us say, diligence and powers of observation, he will be able to reach that. So meaning to say they decry and reject other forms of authority, including, of course, a spiritual authority or otherwise. Now, with the Enlightenment period, of course, what had happened was it happened together with the secularization process, and the secularization process removed the spiritual elements from nature. And as a result of that, with the loss of religion, something had to come in order to replace this sudden vacuum that society is now suffering from. So with the loss of God as the central authority, with the loss of scriptural theology as the means through which to discover God's interest or God's intent for mankind, values then becomes a matter of a struggle between the individual and the society, between the individual and society, between civilization and the individual. Yes. So we see that there were central figures of this time who were critical of the ancient regime. They were critical thinkers who were critical of, as we said, tradition, religion, and everything. And amongst the most, perhaps the most influential of such figures was Voltaire. Yes, Voltaire was of the opinion that we only need to cultivate the powers of reason, and with the gradual discovery of nature and explorations and so on, it was the cult of progress, let us say, we will be able to overcome all of man's problems. Yes. And he believed, I suppose, that even the problems of social unrest, the problems of inequality, injustice, and all sorts of problems that society, I mean, he wasn't unaware of the problems besetting society, but he is of the firm opinion that the cultivation of reason would solve this. Kant did it more philosophically. Kant also did it more beautifully and more systematically through his various works. So Immanuel Kant, for example, set out in his critiques of pure reason, critique of practical reason, and then his treatise on universal peace, and his various other treatises on morality and so on, to set up a system whereby society and individuals within that system, abiding by philosophical ethics, will be able to live justly. So Voltaire is more of a public voice, let us say, for the believers of reason, let us say, in that sense. Rousseau was of a different opinion. It wasn't that he was religious. It wasn't that he wanted to return to the old ways. But this was the times that mankind have started to introduce new forms of thinking in their imagination. One of the things that Rousseau thought about, and which was popular back then, was to think about the state of origins. Yes, what we call the state of nature. Yes, as a basis for present-day criticism and also to draw society forward. So in Rousseau's system, yes, which we can discern through reading a number of his works, chief of which is Emile, which is on education. But before Emile, he had written the Discourse on the Origins of Social Inequality, Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, and another one called On the Social Contract, basically to bolster up his educational theory. In Rousseau's idea, injustice is a result of self-assertion. Injustice is a result of self-assertion. how did it come about? Or inequality came about as a result of civilization, in fact. He imagines the state of nature whereby mankind, let us say, was not influenced by the interests of what society can provide. So therefore, every man lived based on his needs and necessities. And everyone was free to pursue whatever he wants insofar as he can get it. Yes. So therefore, the sicknesses that we associate with the soul, like envy, arrogance, these need not emerge. Yes, and greed need not emerge, because man lived just like an extension of the animal species, like that. Well, in his imagination, it was like that. And then he imagines that with the origins of society, you could imagine that the social division of labor allows for the creation of luxuries. And we have discussed this before with Ibn Khaldun and Aristotle. Yes, the idea is that society affords luxuries, and with luxuries and the possibility of let us say the kind of sedentary living, there are then individuals who foster ambitions within themselves. And with ambitions, there is also the beginnings of self-assertion, where a person desires to be distinguished from other people. A person desires to own a house, so to own properties, and then to be the leader of others, and so on and so forth. So basically, according to Rousseau, let us say in the imagination, that when society reaches the stage of civilization, then society becomes the rock bed of injustices. So then individuals, therefore, who are grown within society, and I believe Ibn Khaldun said something along these lines also, that that your children are more a reflection of their society than they are the result of your own household. In other words, the fact is, society has a tendency to corrupt individuals. Yes, society has a tendency to corrupt individuals. Of course, Rousseau is not saying all this in order that we would then isolate man and allow them to be raised in the jungles and so on. But the idea is, if we can identify the origins of greed, corruption, enmity, envy, and so on and so forth, then we can at least create a sort of sensible environment for the raising of the children until they have now fully formed their own, until they are now fully formed in the harmonious development of their emotions and instincts before releasing them into society, so that they become independent arbiters of society and not be influenced by the corruptions of society. Of course, we can discern some degrees of truth in this. Inshallah, when we discuss the Ba'alawi intellectual tradition, they did establish the notion of a hawta, the idea that the leader of a family would raise his children within an enclosure, of which his children are not to mix with children outside of the enclosure, and those within the enclosure are of his closest relatives, who share his educational outlooks, who share his values, in order that they do not become corrupt by the corruption of society. Of course, there's major differences also between the hawta and this notion that Rousseau is trying to propose. Yes. So in educational treatise, then Rousseau wrote the Emile. It is an important work to be read. According to Alan Bloom, who translated the work, who gave a lengthy annotated introduction to the book, he likened Rousseau's Emile to the Republic of Plato. Yes, because just as Plato tried to outline his philosophy, or his political philosophy, educational theory, and ethics and metaphysics in the context of the founding of a state, Rousseau tried to do something similar to that in the context of the education of a person, the ideal education of a person. Perhaps it is impossible that society actually follow the course that Rousseau proposed in Emile, or any individual. It is virtually impossible for any individual to do that, but it serves as a criticism of society in that sense. So what are the central findings of Rousseau? So since he argued that that corruption is source in society, then he believes that when children are to be raised, first and foremost, they have to be raised in a suitable educational environment, free from societal interventions. Free from societal interventions. They are to be raised in an environment which is as close as possible to nature. As close as possible to nature. They are to be raised with tutors, but the tutor is not to be indoctrinating the child. The tutor may ask questions. Of course, subtly, he's saying that if the tutor understands Rousseau's educational philosophy properly, even in answering questions, you can actually coax the child into a particular educational theory. But nevertheless, the coaxing needs to be done subtly without it being too in the face like that. And at the same time, more importantly, it is to promote the harmonious development of the faculties. And he proposed a delaying, yes, a delaying of the real work of education, I think at least until the age of adolescence. So meaning to say, the real work of education does not begin until adolescence. So in childhood, the purpose of education is merely to unfold the human tendencies in children. And after the unfolding of the human tendencies in the children, in the pubescent stage, let us say now pubescent stage, perhaps between 9 to 13, something like that, then the focus would be to introduce children to crafts, They are not to be introduced yet with theories and social studies and so on, but they are to be introduced to crafts, especially that which would promote their livelihood eventually. Yes, and then eventually at the ages of 12 and above, then he imagines that this young boy will then be introduced to more to history, yes, to the study of history, so that he can see society in a light which is not corrupt, because history is written with the philosophy of education of the writer, philosophy of history of the author, the historiography of the author. And with good selection, the child can be exposed first and foremost to great personalities in history, first and foremost to the great lessons, yes? Because if he were to meet real people, and if he were to meet, let us say in our times, yes, as opposed to the peoples in history, children are exposed, let us say, to the characters in Allahu Akbar, in their daily news, for example, or in the social media. Now, these characters serve more to corrupt them, isn't it? Or if they are introduced to what is being offered in film, in cinema, which is literature, but literature designed to corrupt the modesty of children. Now that they would be corrupted. So therefore, history is preferred. Of course, as Muslims, if you are paying attention, what we would do is to substitute what is valuable in the history of Western in Western history with the seerah of the prophets, the biographies of the awliya, of the Sahaba, the awliya, and the greats, and the kalam and the speeches of the Salafun Salih, so that they will be raised in such a way that they are more well versed with the great authorities of morality. Now these become their reference and standards. And then eventually in the Rousseau's idea, then after the harmonious development of their emotions, once they are taught basically to love the right things and to hate the wrong things, and they have the right kind of instincts for these things, then eventually they will be introduced gradually to the more theoretical subjects like the sciences, and insofar as it is needed. The idea is that it would serve to ameliorate some of the excesses of society. Imagine this was a time that was ripe for revolution, and Rousseau, in fact, of course, what would happen is that what he wrote in the Emile would then be contradicted in his later works. In his writing on the government of Poland, he proposed another system altogether. In that final work, in that later work, he proposed rather that you should have a government-oriented system, yes, where the government would not only determine the curriculum content, the government would also determine the higher staff in the universities. The government would determine if they were loyal or not to the government agenda, and so on and so forth, in order that that basically it becomes an extension of the government. This perhaps was more influential in history, as we see in Germany and the other governments, whereby perhaps this was the origin of what Professor Al-Attas calls the purpose of education as to produce the good citizen, insofar as he is useful for the government. In Emile, on the other hand, perhaps Rousseau was having in mind the education of what would create a gentleman. Yes, that create a gentleman and a person who is free, a person who is happy, and so on and so forth. But that always runs into contrast if there are other interests, there are other, let us say, agents at stake. Nevertheless, yes, in summary, we should say therefore that this is the origins of the later works of educational theories and philosophies. After Rousseau, you would find, of course, there were blatant errors in Rousseau. There were observations that he made which were not historically accurate, which was not sound based on the principles of empiricism or observation. But the idea is that the method that he had chosen, yes, the method that he had chosen, writing it in a novel form, in the form of a novel, and writing it to allow the imagination to run free with regards to educational outlook. Now that's important because it gives us new ideas such that it can be tested, it can be agreed with, disagreed with, it can be augmented, and so on. Now, with proceeding from Rousseau, we see then that the educational theorists that after Rousseau, with the rise of the technocratic age, became more and more a matter of the various schools. Yes, you have in the 20th century the likes of the behaviorist schools. You have the multiple intelligence school, the multiple intelligence believing that that not all individuals share the same, let us say, rational cognitive intelligence, but some may be more musically inclined, others perhaps more good with their hands and crafts, and others are perhaps more emotionally in tune, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, as we see that the loss of the metaphysical aspect of religion, or metaphysical aspect of deriving from religion, the ethics deriving from religion did impact educational theory immensely. Yes, did impact educational theory immensely, especially with regards to the formation of the harmonious development of the individual, the harmonious development of the emotions. Yes, even Rousseau, despite his despite the grandiose picture that he drew in writing as a person, he left his children to be raised in the orphanage, which is ironic, isn't it? Nonetheless, yes, criticisms on his personality aside, even with regards to the writings of the origins of man, the actual description of the nature of man, some of these things are to be challenged. And unfortunate for the secularized modern Western system of education, there's no longer a concrete system that they can judge as a standard. There is no standard that is unmoving with regards to metaphysics, knowledge, and ethics, including the psychology of man, which is why then it becomes the goal of education consistently shifts. And today we find that, which is unfortunate, which is criticized also by Alan Bloom in his bestseller, The Closing of the American Mind. What has happened with regards to liberal education is that education has now become the hostage of politics. Yes, education has now become the hostage of politics and corporations and those who can wield influence in society. Yes, it becomes a contest, a place of contest between the various ideologies, and these individual ideologies, coming as they were from the minds of man, intended to promote their own identity, their own version of liberty, and so on and so forth. None of them has the actual interest of the child. Yes, because how can they have the actual interest of the child when they are they are all basically stuck within the secularistic worldview? Wallahu a'lam. I think that is the extent that we wish to share today. It would be very good if we can have some discussion.
Thank you very much, Ustaz. Towards the end of the discussion just now, you did mention that education has been a hostage for politics, which is true and scary. Is the thing that we are seeing right now, perhaps not just in this country, maybe all over the world. So there's a huge responsibility for people who are aware to do something about it, right? To save education from being the hostage of that politics or any other things, individual power and so on. And anyway, I have a question about when just now you mentioned that the secularization remove the spiritual nature of things, right? And in this context is education. So does it mean that education without the spiritual nature will totally go bad or go useless? Let's discuss about in this context education, right? If we remove the spiritual nature in it, so will it become useless or harmful, or should be disregarded, 100% bad? So your comment, Ustaz.
Okay. So as we said just now, with regards to educational theory and philosophy, we have to go down to the basics. Look at the three things, as we said just now. First, the metaphysics. Yes, what is the metaphysics of a secular education? The metaphysics is the conception of reality. And if reality is empty of any secular meaning whatsoever, any spiritual meaning whatsoever, in other words, then who is man? Yes, the extension would be man is basically an accident of nature. Yes, an accident of nature. Of course, where psychology is concerned, you can think about potentials and how to actualize them. Actualizing of the potentials would mean, so in a secular theory, how to promote and cultivate. So you can have different goals, isn't it, in a secular system? The goal can be, first and foremost, to cultivate the cognitive powers. The cognitive powers, we need to say, with regards to addition, subtraction, with regards to skills in language, and then eventually with regards to competencies and skills. But then, when you take the spiritual element away, what would be the purpose of the cultivation of all these skills? Yes, including, of course, the harmonious development of the emotions. Because why? Because you would want to create a child who is not prone to violence. You would want to create a child, or insofar as education is concerned, you want to foster the development of socially friendly children, children who are prone to give and take, children who submit to the law, yes, who don't cut queues, children who are not disruptive of their friends. In the end, what do you have there? Yes, you have then, unfortunately, with the extreme secularization picture, you have then the school and then the university as factories, ultimately, isn't it? It's a factory for promotion of the utilitarian value of children, or utilitarian value in children. They may say that we are fostering this school or this university to create leaders. Nevertheless, it is the leader that serves the whose end ultimately. Yes, they can say that we want to, our goal is for 100% employment. All our students will be employed in the workforce. But employment for what sake? Yeah? And of course, that would mean, if you have that machine end in mind, so first it would be marketability. Then after your children have been, the students have been marketed, when they have now entered into the working environment, then they will have to go through upskilling, isn't it? Upskilling from now and then they will have to be trained. They will be treated like machines. We need to say like cars. You know, when cars go out of operant functioning, they will have to be serviced. Yes, they will have to be serviced, and then eventually they, you know, once their productive years are behind them, then they get chucked away. Waliyadzubillah. So that's the ultimate end of you know, this spiritualized education. Let us say then we desire an alternative. Well, this is one school. This is the majority. The majority of society will have to go through this, because you'll get back to remember what we described in the earliest discussions about Sparta, in the earliest discussion about Athens. It wasn't that everyone in Athens were to be treated as slaves. Yes, as we said just now, as we said earlier, that the male citizens would not be slaves, because they would be free to develop their philosophic ideals. They would be free to study philosophy. They would be free to pursue the life of friendship. But the great majority, yes, which was colonized, would become slaves to serve the interests of the corporate few. How is it different from the modern system, secularized system of education? Isn't it? The great majority of people will have to go through this system in order to feed the demands of the growing marketplace, the demands of the growing financial markets, in order to sustain the development of neoliberal capitalism and its various machineries. But the select few will have the opportunity of you know, the select few who are, let us say, enriched within the system. If they are supported by others, they will be free to study, you know, philosophy, you know, theology, history, enjoy themselves at art galleries and so on and so forth. But to what end, ultimately? Yes. So that's why we need that's why, you know, there is we will have to have just an honorable mention, but we do not allocate a particular section or a particular lecture on this. But an alternative philosophies of education, it is also good to study, you know, like Frantz Fanon and several of the other works that promote decolonization and de-westernization of knowledge, like the writings of Voltaire and several others. When we studied worldviews and epistemic frameworks with Professor Wan, he recommended that we should read these works to understand the alternative critiques to that dominant educational theory. But I thank you for your question.
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much, Ustaz. So we have another question by Brother Zahar. Assalamualaikum, Ustaz. In Islamic terms, what about kids in the city? In the background here in our country, Malaysia, the rural areas, meanwhile, lack education, infrastructure, and shortage of manpower. Professor Al-Attas mentioned that secularism is certainly more rampant in urban setting out. How do we actually implement the best of urban and rural settings in an Islamic educational concept? So how about the kids in the city? So, Tafadhal, Ustaz.
Well, there's a lot that you have put in this question with regards to the rural and urban divide. So remember when Professor Al-Attas wrote about, I think in Prolegomena, how secularization reaches the rural areas, it would begin from the urban areas, because in the urban areas is where education is most developed. In the urban areas is where the educational infrastructure is most developed. In the urban areas is also suggestible minds, yes, who receive this you know, educational content from their university days and through various other means, formal, non-formal, informal. And then once the secularized ideals enter into their mind, it spreads, as Professor Al-Attas describes, beautifully like wildfire until it reaches even the rural areas, unless, of course, those in the rural areas have prepared themselves with an alternative philosophic educational outlook sufficiently so as to be able to contain, yes, the spread of secularization. And it is easy to understand why secularization is more rampant in the urban areas, because as the German Max Weber used to say, that one of the fundamental meanings of secularization is basically the result of economic liberalism or economic capitalism, which is the functional allocation of talents. In other words, when individuals are reduced to their economic functions, yes, then it would lead to a reclassification of society, yes, and eventually it's a secularization, which is basically a loosening activity. Yes, what does it loosen? It loosens out your i'tiqad, yes, your creedal beliefs. It loosens your morality because everything has to be in flux. That's the basic meaning of secularization. So certainly in the urban areas, this is more rampant, yes, because it is through the practices of the workplace that that necessitates so many things that challenges social mores. Yes, perhaps in a society of very strict social roles, let us say between males and females. Well, now the workplace will challenge that because you can no longer afford, let us say, gender segregation in the workplace. So that would have some impact on morality. When you can no longer have the privilege, let us say, and this happens, isn't it? When you no longer have the privilege of staying together as husband and wife within the same house, when the husband or the wife needs to be posted somewhere for work, this will have an impact on morality, religion, and basically that's secularization, to be rooted in the here and now. So certainly it is more rampant. It doesn't mean that nothing can be done or nothing should be done about it. And this is where Islamization of knowledge is concerned. But yes, so now if we say then that secularization affects the urban, so then if the question, what about children in the cities? Can they be given a good environment of education? I believe so. They can. They can still be given what is fundamental about education, meaning to say, supposing now that we have to experiment with new things. We know that even Professor Al-Attas said this, that adab is best learned in the household, meaning to say the first 7 years of your life is best learned in the household. But supposing you cannot have that, meaning to say, supposing out of the requirements of the workplace, now both mother and father have to work. Whereas in traditional societies, you have not only the mother as the primary caretaker, the father also, would spend time with his children. And as Professor Wan used to say that they say these days, in order to compensate for their loss of time with their children, they say that what is important is quality, yes, rather than quantity. But we say, or Professor Wan says, that even within the notion of quality, yes, quantity is a component, isn't it? You cannot spend 5 minutes with your children in the weekend and expect that to cover for the rest of the week. That perhaps they have spent watching television that they will have to unlearn, and Netflix and the internet and so on. So then, therefore, it will need a collective societal effort. It is, of course, lengthy and unnecessary, isn't it? But now that we've come to this stage, what can be done? And so therefore, it becomes then a matter of consumer choice, developing better offers out there, meaning in the sense that, well, now that you have to think about early childhood education for your children, you have, for some who can afford it, perhaps we can advise that they should take some time off. Yes, who can afford it, they should take some time off, go on an adventure with their children, spend a few years in Tarim, perhaps, and allow the golden age of
inshallah.
to be in that. But this is not a choice available to everyone. So what then is the other possibilities? Well, we need to develop new communities. One of the things that I think Harvey Cox said in The Secular City is that the secular city, and we must understand this now, the secular city changes the nature of communities. One of the things that the secular city does is that it loosens also the bond of neighborliness, and it loosens the bond of community based on qarabah, community based on blood relations. but it opens up spaces to community based on shared values. Now, this is something that we can pursue really seriously. Community based on shared values, community fostered on friendship, such that we can still preserve the dictum that it takes an entire village to raise children, meaning to say a village of virtuous people. Yes, so you can still determine, meaning to say that to a large extent, who are your children's friends, who are your friends, yes, who you allow to enter into your house, and who do you share public spaces with, even though these public spaces are now perhaps rented, even though these public spaces are perhaps something that you share only for 1 hour in the week, but it will have an impact on the children. The idea is the age of children, the age of childhood, pubescence, adolescence, these are very crucial periods to plant the seeds of iman and taqwa. And so therefore, we must try to implement whatever that is necessary. And those who are in the Islamic educational systems, yes, in the Islamic educational schools, or even in the conventional schools, who understand these things, they must play their role even more. Yes, in the sense that the doctor is a doctor to everyone, the teacher must understand that, especially for those who are involved in early childhood education, up to adolescence and beyond, that part of their task is not only ta'lim in the sense of instruction, there is also the nurturing component. Yes, the nurturing component is necessary. This is the emotion, for the sake of the emotional development of children. Yes, some of the I heard that some time ago they proposed that that teachers in schools, that they must undergo, let us say, psychological testing in order that they are emotionally balanced. Well, I understand where this concern is coming from. Meaning to say that you shouldn't have, say, a teacher who is emotionally, psychologically unstable to deal with your children. Yes, but perhaps it is not through psychological testing, but rather the idea that the teachers themselves must involve themselves in a form of educational training to develop and foster their own emotional outcome. They must be taught the content of education and the content of the rights of the students and the responsibilities of teachers, what can be said, what cannot be said. And we would be surprised to hear some of the personality types that have come up as teachers, because some of them join the teaching profession. I'm not saying all or a great majority, but I have witnessed and experienced some of them who joined the teaching profession only because it is the only economic choice. Meaning to say they do not have the personality or the interest or the emotive abilities of a teacher, but they just do so because it's an economic opportunity. But they will impact the children. Yes, I remember once giving a talk at one of these very prominent schools, and there was when I asked the students in the school, what is the main obstacle for them to learn, all of them point to this particular teacher. And yes, we would say that if it was one or two, perhaps we could say that the child was problematic. But one particular student said that, well, this teacher hated her so much. She said, because the teacher said that because she looked, yes, her face, she looked like the teacher's enemy. Yes, she's taking her own emotional baggage on the children that has no business in that. Now, that kind of emotional development, I mean, that kind of emotional jarring, that kind of emotional attack on children can have lasting impact on their development. Yes, so therefore, these are some of the things that we have to concern ourselves with if we want to develop properly.
Yeah, thank you, Ustaz. It is our responsibility now to create the village, inshallah, anywhere we are. Allah SWT help all of us to create the village for our children, or for our next generation, inshallah. So everyone, so I noticed that the participation grows like after 20 minutes of the session starts. So perhaps we can start maybe 20 minutes later, inshallah, next week. Only after 20 minutes, then the crowd grows.
And then they will come 30 minutes after that.
Okay, then we should start maybe 20 minutes earlier. But anyway, everyone, thank you again for joining, and thank you for participating. And I think we are going to wrap the session for tonight. With the Ustaz has concluded the session by answering 2 questions just now. And again, if you need a recommendation of reading for this session, inshallah, there will be about, if I'm not mistaken, 2 more sessions before we end this series. About 2 or 3 more, but you are welcome to share your opinions, or maybe you have any question. If you need a recommended reading, you can refer to our page Faslun for more information about this. This session will be recorded and also will be uploaded in our YouTube for your future reference, inshallah. May this session benefit all of us who is here and who is not. Maybe you can help by extending the knowledge by sharing the videos or the sharing by Ustaz, inshallah. So that's a wrap for tonight. Thank you very much, Jazakumullah khairan kathirah, for everyone, especially to Ustaz. You have any questions, brother Abdurrahman? You're waving your hand. No, you're saying goodbye. Okay, all right.
No, he's saying bye-bye.
Okay, I thought you have a question. Sorry about that. Okay, so wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.